Party time is fun time for all. Opening the presents, playing games, singing songs are all part of the birthday feeling. Here's Sammy Jean Connell, who is 9 years old today, one of the old-timers in the gang, because when she was born, television, too, was just an infant. The magic of television was still a household word. That's when we were watching Stage It, Two Bees at the Keys, Time for Beanie, and Crusader Rabbit. But TV was growing from a squalling infant through adolescence and into adulthood by the time Jody Whitlock was born. And as far as he is concerned, there is no such thing as before television. We at King have had the pleasure of knowing many wonderful people in the entertainment world. Many have paused briefly on the King stage, and many more have remained in the family year after year. You know them all, we're sure, and they are pleased that you can join them today at this 10th birthday party.
Andy B, where's the turkey? Oh, gee. Come in, sit down, gentlemen. Excuse me, Tom. Which one were you? This one or this one? Oh. You gonna stay this time? Hey, look who's here.
Pretty bouquet. Where shall I put it?
Right there. The natives are restless tonight.
Here's a
Wonderful place for it, Jack.
Don't here we go.
Say, folks, this gives us a chance here to visit a little bit with you. We're all in Annie B. Dollivan's.
Stan?
Dollivan's calendar set. Yeah.
Stan, it beat omnibus.
I understand you're a partner with Tippy Dye now. They're going to do a show called Tippy and Lippy.
I refuse to be intimidated. Listen, I may get embarrassed and quit talking.
Promises, promises. That's all we ever get. Look who couldn't stand the idea of being home on a holiday.
Yeah, sure, yes.
Welcome home.
You know, we've been talking about what everybody's been doing over the past 10 years, and there's a few people here that we haven't checked on yet, and I was wondering what Ruth Wanda Prinz was doing 10 years ago today.
A whole 10 years.
Stealing tires in Portland?
No, 10 years ago, my husband and I were playing with Lillian Gish in a stage play and deciding that theater was for us. Oh, at the time there was a little thing called television, but we knew it wouldn't last.
Wise choice.
That theater was
Hey, excuse me, just a minute, Stan. I just happened to think of something. We're asking what's going on or what went on 10 years ago with each of us. Look, would you pose for me just for a minute? Like that. Right close to that camera there. Right, good and close there, Ed, if you will. Note the character lines, the maturity of face and bearing and manner.
Makeup didn't cover it up, huh?
Now, you know, we've been real busy around here going through reams and boxes and rooms full, literally, of film, finding these films that Bill O'Meara and some of the rest of the fellows have been showing you. And we found one, quite by accident, I'd say it was made in about 1949. Now, note the look of maturity, and now, note this.
Frida, my clam digger sweetheart, I love you madly. I need you.
You know, that brings back a lot of memories, though, because I remember when Art Bardoon and I started 9.5 years ago. And that was, the old studio was down by Skipper's Seafood. And after we rehearsed for the first 15-minute show, we started out as Two Bees at the Keys, 15 minutes, we went down to Skipper's to have a bite there, and I was talking to her, and I says, do you think now, Art, that we should plan a little bit what we're going to do next week, or do you think we dare to plan what we're going to do for 10 weeks? Ahead, you know, a little bit. He said, well, I think we'll last for 10 weeks, so we planned for 10 weeks. 9.5 years.
And those 10 shows have lasted 9 years.
I got a telegram from Art here, and he wishes all of us the very best on our anniversary, he threw his back. He was going to be here, you know, but he threw his back out, and yeah, so he wouldn't have to come. And he'll be in a wheelchair for 3 weeks.
Oh, gee, that is really too bad.
Shame.
Well, at least it is not a permanent situation.
I didn't get to find out what Tom Dargan was doing on 10 years ago.
I was playing in the same show with Ruth and Bob.
What were you doing?
I had a beard that long, and I used to write messages to the other members of the cast on my forehead. Remember? And List Now was one that was good.
That's where they got the idea for the telephone.
Say, incidentally, Elliot Brown, who has been playing all the music on our special party show today, had a real interesting experience that involved Wanda here. Remember that?
Well, we had a story, and we had about a lion, and we had a live lioness on the program.
Little
It
tight.
was a misunderstanding about signals, you see. She wanted to be petted, and I didn't understand that. I thought she wanted lunch. The funniest part was that after the story was over, she proceeded to prowl up and down the studio, but unfortunately, right behind our wonderful music man, Elliot Brown. Now, Mr. Brown is a man of infinite resource and sagacity, but when he felt a tug at his coattails, and he turned around and saw a large and grinning lion, he found the lost chord.
She's eating you there, Ruth.
Gumming me to death. Well, he didn't hurt at all, you know.
They told Ruth not to worry because the lion was raised on milk, and her retort was, so was I, but I eat meat every night.
Say, Bob Hale, I haven't heard from you. What were you doing 10 years ago?
Well, let me see. 10 years ago, I was about 19 years old, and that was when we formed Genius Incorporated, and I started drawing cartoons commercially. And that's all I've done all my life, is draw cartoons. I never thought I'd be on television doing it, but here we are.
You going to stay in this business?
Or are you going to... Well, I'll be around as long as the weather agrees with me. Let's put it
Gee whiz, it's wonderful to welcome back Dick Ross and Tom Dargan from KGW-TV in Portland, who took this opportunity to come down. O'Mara.
No, we've been away.
Say, looking at the friendly face of Bill Nielsen down there, well, it's probably too long a story, but I was thinking of the outboard motor.
I remember it well, Bill.
Watch how easily it starts.
That was the line, only we decided to leave it out because we didn't hear the outboard running. And the next line in the script was, how would you like to have all that power behind your boat?
Oh, boy. You know, I think this would be a wonderful opportunity since Dick is here and Stan is here and Mike is here. You know, they used to be known as the Kingpins. Ted, you replaced a singer in the news department.
Filled the vacancy, but didn't replace the singer.
So I would think it'd be a...
No. I'm a newcomer here. I haven't heard them.
I think in a little while we should get them to do a number for us. But,
Nice recovery.
When Dick left, he left this on his desk, and it hasn't done me any good for 2 years. I'd like you to take it.
Gee, thanks a lot.
Stan, you mentioned Art a while ago and mentioned his telegram to us. How about bringing him back in spirit and picture with a little duet?
We used to play the 12th Street Rag. We used to have fun with that one. Maybe we can find those good old days, huh?
Yeah, do you play this?
Are you ready?
Yeah.
We practiced a little bit. Now, Richard and Mike and I used to... No, we didn't. No. We didn't have time. But let's try one of the old ones anyway.
Which one?
sleigh bells ring. Are you listening? In the lane, snow is glistening. A beautiful sight, we're happy tonight, walking in the winter wonderland. Gone away is the bluebird, here to stay is the new bird. He sings a love song as we go along, walking in the winter wonderland. In the meadow we can build a snowman. We'll pretend that he is Parson Brown. He'll say, are you married? We'll say, no, man. But you can do the job when you're in town.
There were two names that made the news in Seattle on Thanksgiving Day in 1950 and 1952. They were John Paulman, who was 8 today, and Paul Cederland, who was celebrating his 6th birthday. These two youngsters didn't make the headlines, but they were a mighty important part in the Northwest scene. They and the thousands like them typify the growth and expansion of the Seattle area. They made the news in the past, and they will make the news in the future. These are the future statesmen, the business leaders, the entertainers, and the educators. Yes, these are the young people who will make the news in the years to come.
This is Bob Considine in New York. I've been a lucky fellow in this business of reporting. Over the past 10 years, I think I've covered the great events of all nature all over the face of the earth. I think the great thing that has emerged in those 10 years, it seems to me, in the field of communications, has been the emergence of television as a means of reporting the news. And just 10 years ago, in your very city, one of the great strides was made in television, the inauguration of KING TV's first newscast by television. Well, in those 10 years, great strides have been made until today. KING TV is recognized throughout the entire industry as one of the great leaders in its field. My congratulations, sincere congratulations, to Chuck Herring, Ted Bryant, Kurt Fortney, and all the other members of the KING TV News TV staff. I know that from here you can only get bigger and better and continue your great job in reporting local, national, and international news.
Thank you very much, Bob Considine, and we wish that you, Bob, could be here with you, our viewers out there, to meet again the gentlemen on our News Bureau, present and past. First of all, young man born on the same day of the year as yours truly, hails from Walla Walla, as does yours truly, but I should add was born 7 years later than yours truly. You're a host on The World Today, Ted Bryant. And then we have Kurt Fortney, one of the top reporters in any media of communication hereabouts, a man who worked several years on the Bremerton Sun before joining us a little over 2 years ago. And finally, the singer and newscaster par excellence, our old friend back up from KGW-TV, my longtime associate here, Dick Ross. Dick, real glad to have you here.
Well, it's real good to be back, Chuck. Get back here with you fellas, and it's almost as though I haven't been away.
Well, gentlemen, we have gone into our film files and dusted them off, and some of them were pretty dusty. And let's relive now for a few minutes some of the top stories of the past 10 years that KING TV has been on the air. And let's start with the assumption that in the news business on television, no matter what else you might say about it, one thing, it never is dull, not for very long. And we'll take a case in point. Our first telecast of The World Today, that was our original news show, and it was seen at 6:45 in the evening. And it was the first live show, incidentally, news show west of Minneapolis or north of San Francisco. The first show was on September 17th of 1951, and within 3 days, we had our first big story, and it remains to this day the biggest one in that category that we have covered. If you'll recall, the summer of 1951 was a lot like 1958. It was extremely dry and hot, and by September, there had been no appreciable rainfall for 3 months. The long dry spell was taking its toll. The streams were down to a trickle. Lawns were turning brown, and in the mountains, the woods were tinder dry. Now, we got through 1958 without a major forest fire, but in 1951, we weren't that lucky. On the morning of September 20th, a logger in the northern part of the Olympic Peninsula noticed a wisp of smoke trailing through the air. the apparent result of an earlier small fire which had smoldered for days. Fanned by a stiff breeze which suddenly sprang up, this minor blaze soon became a roaring juggernaut of red destruction, sweeping all before it. For a time, the Quileute Naval Air Station was in danger, but the wind shifted and it was saved. Right in the path of the flames was the little logging town of Forks, population 1,000. Its residents hurriedly evacuated their homes. Women and children fled down the highway in automobiles. The few women who stayed behind manned the Forks Telephone Company switchboard, answering calls from anxious relatives in other parts of the Northwest. All through the night and into the next day, the battle continued. At the end of 36 hours, scores of red-eyed men huddled in little groups, still hardly able to believe it. The danger was past, but Forks had suffered a substantial loss. The fire had burned out the eastern end of the town, destroying 28 homes, 2 auto repair shops, and a lumber mill. The mill belonged to George Beck, shown here. He was a man in his 60s, had no insurance. Neither did young Leroy Johnson, whose home had burned to the ground, the home he had labored for 2 long years to build and had moved into just 2 days before. They were only 2 out of many victims of the worst forest fire in the state of Washington in this decade. By the time it was controlled, the flames had burned over 20,000 acres of rich timberland. The estimated loss, $20 million. That story was shot for us by cameraman Ed Racine. It was our first big one, and in the line of forest fires, it remains to this day the biggest one we have covered. Gentlemen, we interrupt the script for one moment. Final score, Renton 7, Roosevelt nothing. Meanwhile, back at the script. Dick,
Yes.
you joined us in the middle of 1952. And what was the first big one that you remember going on?
Well, Chuck, that was the Saturday before Christmas that year. The assignment took me to a desolate spot on the prairie halfway across the state. There near Moses Lake, what was at that time the worst crash in the history of aviation occurred at 6:30 that morning. A giant C-124 Globemaster transport plane with 115 servicemen aboard went down 60 agonizing seconds after taking off for San Antonio on a Christmas furlough flight. Frankly, it was a sight I'd just as soon never witness again. But in the job of covering the news, you run into a lot of things that are far from pleasant. The death toll in a single accident since has been exceeded, but as of that bleak day in December '52, it was a record, 87 men killed. Speaking of big stories, though, I should like to go back a month in that same year to one that could have been tragic, but fortunately turned out to have a much happier ending. 17-year-old Edwin Sandy had been lost in the wilds of the Olympic Peninsula for 5 chilling November days. Somehow, the lightly clad young hunter managed to survive until searchers found him at the mouth of Goodman Creek. He was brought by boat to La Push, then ferried by Coast Guard helicopter to the Quileute Naval Air Station, where cameraman Ted Simpson and I were waiting to interview him.
Well, Dick, we've gone on so many of those lost stories. We've had lost skiers, mountain climbers, hunters, fishermen. One time we even had a lost Army paratrooper, you'll recall, who bailed out over the Cascades when the plane in which he was riding got into trouble. I think my favorite survival story, though, in the mountains concerns a 19-year-old mountain climber by the name of Bob Grant. Back in 1952, he and a companion had climbed to the top of 8,000-foot Mount Stewart when a thunderstorm came up. The two were struck by lightning not once, but several times. Grant's climbing companion was killed, but Grant managed to survive. Badly burned and suffering from shock, he half crawled, half fell down the slopes of the peak. 2 days later, he was found by rescuers, weak, but still in good spirits. Take it from him. There is no truth to the old adage about lightning never striking twice in the same place.
And in 1955, we covered a story that concerned the survival of not 1, but 19 persons, all of them aboard an airliner that ditched off the Oregon coast after it became evident that the pilot could not get the big plane back to land.
That's right, Dick. And cameraman Ted Simpson and I, in doing that story on film, had one of the most rigorous days we've ever put in. The survivors, most of them from Seattle, were brought back here aboard the Navy transport Bayfield. We boarded the vessel several miles out of Seattle, shot interviews which were distributed by newsreel to TV stations and theaters all over the country. When the vessel arrived at Pier 91, KING did a live pickup from the scene as the survivors stepped back aboard dry land. And the caskets containing the bodies of the 4 persons on the flight who perished in the cold water after the ditching were lowered over the side. We also had our live cameras on the spot on July 15th of 1954 for an event which seems to grow in importance with each passing year, particularly this year, which sees the inauguration of the first American jet passenger service. This all started at Boeing Airplane Company's Renton plant with the maiden flight of Boeing 707 prototype. The company's chief test pilot, Alvin M. Tex Johnston, was at the controls with Dick Slesh. The takeoff was perfect on this historic first flight of an American jet transport. An hour and 20 minutes later, the 707 was ready to land at Boeing Field. Again, a hush of expectancy fell over the crowd, but the big plane touched down as gracefully as a veteran of thousands of hours in the air. Now, since that exciting day, Boeing has taken orders for 187 of the 707s, contracts totaling $825 million. Already, Pan American World Airways is flying the jets on regular commercial runs across the Atlantic. Early next year, American Airlines will begin transcontinental jet flights. A while back, we were talking about the fact that a lot of assignments in the news-gathering business are far from pleasant. And Dick, I know that you undoubtedly put the trip that you made to the Greenwood branch of Seattle First National Bank on a March afternoon in 1954 in that class.
Yes, certainly, Chuck. I haven't forgotten that one, and neither has any member of the Seattle police force. The Greenwood stick-up, in which one policeman was killed and 2 others wounded by 3 masked bandits, is the only Washington State bank robbery which the FBI has not marked solved. However, the FBI has publicly expressed the belief that the men who pulled that job are in prison in Canada. The bandits got only $6,900, leaving behind an additional $90,000 that they already had sacked up when officers Howard Schlesman, Vernon Chase, and Frank Hardy surprised them. Schlesman and Chase were seriously wounded, but later returned to duty. Hardy was dead within minutes in the state's most talked about bank robbery in the 10 years since King TV came on the air. Some of our biggest stories involving the criminal element have taken place in the state's various penal institutions, like the riot and fire at the Washington State Reformatory at Monroe in August of 1953. These are shots we took during the night of that uprising.
And a few weeks later, inmates at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla set fire to the prison's metals plant. The $650,000 blaze destroyed some 700,000 license plates made at the penitentiary, and until a new plant was built recently, the state had to go to private manufacturers to get a fresh supply. After that, things were relatively quiet until the 5th of July, 1955, when some post-Independence Day fireworks were touched off at the penitentiary. 33 convicts seized 9 guards, held 7 of them hostage for 26 hours, while they bargained with state officials over the changes they wanted in the penitentiary. The then State Director of Institutions, Dr. Thomas Harris, had been on the job a scant 2 weeks when the uprising took place. Through the bars of a small anteroom separating the warden's office from the main prison, news photographers, including Channel 5 Simpson, could see Harris negotiating with the rebellious inmate spokesman for the release of the hostages, which he eventually obtained and which resulted in some joyous reunions outside the walls. You know, they say that trouble always comes in bunches, and sometimes it seems as though news stories work that way. Because we had just barely gotten back in Seattle after covering that penitentiary uprising in July of 1955, when a burly 275-pound ex-Marine named Bert Thomas finally succeeded in doing what no other person had ever accomplished, swimming the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Because Thomas had made many unsuccessful attempts to negotiate the treacherous 18-mile stretch of water between Port Angeles and Victoria, we didn't take this effort seriously until it was almost too late. As Thomas swam on through the night, cameraman Tom Welty and I chartered a plane, flew to Victoria, got a cab to the beach, and arrived just in time to record the dramatic scene as Thomas touched shore and was pulled into an accompanying boat 11 hours and 10 minutes after leaving Port Angeles. I guess that's the ancient history department, Dick. And now I think it's high time that we got around to your successor, the gentleman who has carried on with the same excellent pattern of World Today that you established before going down to KGW. And Ted, based on the experiences that you've had reporting the news, what have you found to be unusual about this job?
almost everything. No, I think, Chuck, that most of our viewers recognize the emphasis that we place on speed in the job. For instance, it isn't unusual for us to do an interview at the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport at 5 o'clock and have that story on early edition at 6:30. We, of course, have to hustle quite a good deal. When the distances are greater, getting that film back to the laboratory for processing becomes much more of a problem. And, Chuck, I think you had one experience yourself in that connection. As I recall, it occurred at Medical Lakes Eastern State Hospital late in 1957. A stocky 62-year-old Dr. Garrett Hines, who had taken over as the state director of institutions only weeks before, unhesitatingly walked into the maximum security building where some 150 inmates held 200 hostages, convinced them that their fears about a rumored new Get Tough policy were unfounded. Well, there was no way of guessing how long it might take Hines to turn that trick, so Chuck hurried back to Geiger Field, several miles away, to ship back the first roll of film, assuming that the uprising would still be in progress when he returned. It had been over for some 30 minutes when he got back. The hostages had long since been released. The excitement was over, but cameraman Merle Severin rose to the occasion and did his own interviews.
And we saw a shot of Severin there in the next to last picture. Well, that's the way the ball bounces sometimes, Ted. Incidentally, I can be serious for just a moment. Our viewers who have read advance publicity about this 10-year news review may wonder when it is over why we have included no films on the Dave Beck story. Now, to head off telephone calls, etc., and set the record straight right here, let me say that we have been asked and have agreed to delete that portion of the film. The request to do that came from Federal District Court at Tacoma and was made to prevent any possible influencing of any of the jurors in Beck's income tax evasion trial who might happen to be tuned in. Well, the news is a waiting game many times, and sometimes the results are fruitful, sometimes they are not so fruitful. Kurt, you did a lot of waiting, just standing around and waiting for something to happen and covering one of the top crime stories of last year, but I think you'll agree it was worth it, wasn't it?
Well, Chuck, story ends as happily as the Crary kidnapping case did. It's worth waiting for. 8-year-old Lee Crary of Edmonds, a youngster with a cool head and a high IQ, was missing from his home for 3 days until he turned up near Lake Stevens. And even though a ransom note had been received and FBI men were swarming over the area, law enforcement authorities still found it difficult to believe the boy's amazingly accurate story of how a nice young man he knew as Bob forced him into his car, kept him in the automobile day and night, except when the two of them would sit in the woods during the daylight hours and watch spiders devour flies. The boy's account of how he finally escaped was one that astounded even Snohomish County Sheriff Bob Twitchell.
Here's an interesting sidelight on this. He said, I watched TV and watched Wild Bill Hickok, and he was tied up, and he reached down with his teeth, he said, and he went like this and pulled the buckle apart. That's what he did.
Bob, it turned out, was a penniless, unemployed riveter. 20-year-old George Edward Collins, now serving his sentence for the crime. Implicated with him, his common-law wife. With his victim's help, officers had no trouble apprehending Collins. 8-year-old Lee Crary had memorized the license number on Collins' car. The boy took the excitement which followed his return in stride as easily as he had the kidnapping, tossed off a press conference like an old pro.
Well, I think I was up near the Lake Stevens area, but I think I was really well taken care of by the man that took me that night.
Where did he pick you up, Lee?
Well, he picked me up over by the Lindale School, where he found my bike at.
Spot news coverage, of course, is more or less of a daily routine around here, but some stories stand out in the minds of the individual reporters. In my case, I particularly remember the circumstances surrounding a case on just October 2nd of this year in a robbery murder of a West Seattle bowling alley operator. The victim, Robert Blair, was at work behind the counter at about 1 a.m. when he was attacked and slain by a robber armed with a baseball bat and a gun. Both weapons were used in the crime. From persons who had been in the bowling alley prior to the attack, police obtained the license number of the killer's automobile. But where was the car? The license number was broadcast to all police units. Tow truck drivers were on the lookout, too. One such driver, John Whitehead, pictured here, has a good memory for numbers. Whitehead spotted the wanted car and gave chase. Police were alerted. Cameraman Tom Weldy and I hurried to a point of possible interception. Our guesses were right. These exclusive films of the actual arrest of the murderer were the result of cameraman Weldy's work, some of the most dramatic crime sequences we have ever filmed.
Well, Kurt, you should have given us a little advance warning. We might have set up a live camera and carried that one on the spot. Actually, there have been at least two major news stories the past year that we have done live as well as on film. There was the Ravenna Hole, or the Glory Hole, as city engineer Roy Morris called it, a yawning chasm that suddenly appeared in Ravenna Boulevard near 16th Avenue Northeast about a year ago. It was caused by the collapse of a 50-year-old sewer line 145 feet beneath the street, an artery that still isn't completely repaired. We maintained a vigil at that spot with live cameras for several days until there was no longer any danger of the houses on the lip of the hole going into it.
And our engineering department set up a live remote telecast in near record time on the night of May 20th of this year to cover the most costly fire Seattle has had in decades, possibly in all time since the Great Fire in 1889, the $1,675,000 blaze at the Seattle Cedar Lumber Mill. That was the only live camera coverage afforded TV viewers direct from the scene.
Well, Chuck, it's certainly been an exciting 10 years news-wise, and I know that there
Yes,
isn't
it has.
a single man here who would dare hazard a guess as to what the next 10 years will bring.
Well, I think there's one thing we can count on, Dick. It's going to be a very important 10 years for Seattle as well as the entire Pacific Northwest.
Well, that's true, and the proof of it is provided by the mammoth building program now underway here. Seattle is not only spreading out, it's spreading upward. Some $35 to $40 million worth of new buildings, many of them in the skyscraper class, are being built in the downtown area. The two biggest are the 21-story Norton building under construction at First and Columbia, and the 20-story Washington building at 4th and Union. Their combined cost comes to over $20 million. Also taking shape, the 10-story, $3 million Logan building, a $2 million annex to the main office of National Bank of Commerce, and a 7-story addition to the City Light building, which will cost $3.5 million. Millions of dollars worth of new motels have been and are being built in the Seattle area, including a $1 million building at Aurora and Thomas. And dozens of public facilities are on the drawing boards or already underway. New schools like this junior high being built at a cost of $2.5 million in Seattle's northwest section. A new $5 million public library at 4th and Madison. New highway facilities, including a multi-million-dollar freeway through the city and an extension of the Alaskan Way Viaduct. Yes, our city has just begun to grow, and the next decade may well be the most significant in its history. We here at Channel 5 expect to be part of it. We of the Channel 5 News Bureau in particular pledge to do our best to chronicle those exciting developments in a continuing program of comprehensive news coverage covering the next 10 years. And now, gentlemen, something real big is about to happen across the studio. Let's go over and see what it is.
Big man, got it good there, kiddo. You know, you can just take one look at that cake and tell that Chuck Reed can do a tremendous job. Come on, Dick, dig in.
Just that top piece of
Yeah, plenty for everybody.
That's fine. We don't want any more. We gotta finish our song, Dick. Yeah. We gotta finish our song. Cut us off.
We're still waiting. Oh, okay. I was over in the meadow when the
Cake? You just saw a man's hand, but let me tell you, that's a mighty important hand, because that hand belongs to the man behind the camera, just one of the many pairs of hands without whose work our hands in front of the camera would indeed be tied. None of these things that we have reviewed today on our 10th anniversary party could have been done without those additional hands. And I think that perhaps this 10th anniversary party of ours is a pretty good time to pause and reflect just a bit on the tremendous influence and growth, the impact on the American way of life that has been made by this young monster or genius or combination of all called television. You know that we Americans have more telephones
fewer telephones, I should say, fewer bathtubs than we have television sets. Seriously, though, no invention, no product has ever so completely infused and influenced the American daily routine of living in so short a time as has television. Nor has any product or any invention ever had the opportunity of serving so many in so little time, both in entertainment and in the public good. You and I work perhaps a 40-hour work week. Did you know that the average television set in the American home works for us, serves us, 42 hours a week on the average? How many of us, before the advent of television, could have attended a political convention, a national convention, a presidential inauguration, the coronation of a queen, or the World Series, for that matter? But you and I, we've seen them all, probably, thanks to this wonderful thing called television. We thank you very much for the pleasure of your company today on our 10th anniversary. We hope that during the coming decade we may continue to warrant your friendship and appreciation. You know, reflecting on the impact of television makes us all just a little humble and also a little proud. So I hope you'll bear with me if there's a little pride in my voice when I say now, this is King Television.